What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
Why do Catholics worship Mary? Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
Where is purgatory in the Bible?
I think the Pope has too much authority.
What's stopping you? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you yourself are not a currently practicing Catholic, maybe you were an active Catholic years ago, fell away from the faith for whatever reason, and now you've got some interest in the Catholic faith, and you specifically want to know, why does the Catholic Church teach this, this, and this? And they're saying, not so much on this, this, and this. Do give us a call. We'll clear that up for you. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. Those of you watching on TV today, you can participate as well. Our email address, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. All right, Charles Beery is our producer. Matt Gabinski is our phone screener. Jeff Burson handles social media for us. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook Live, we're streaming there right now. All you have to do is put your question in the comments box. Jeff will send that to us here in the studio. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Very well. How are you, my friend?
You know, I'm doing decent, thank you.
Glad to hear that. We have an objection to the faith here.
Okay.
This is an email that we received from Gerard. Gerard says, when responding to the fact that there were some corrupt individuals leading the church, I often hear Catholics say that, quote, well, it's not the church that's imperfect, but the people in her. Well, if church and God are real, then wouldn't God give grace to priests and popes to be perfect as well? I guess what I'm ultimately asking is, why do Catholics often fail to live up to their ideals of perfection?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the question. Let me come at this from a number of different angles. First of all, let me come at the idea of the church as a perfect society, and whether in a perfect society every member should realize the ends or goals of that society. And I don't think I would agree with that. I don't think that's the way the church understands herself either. The church does have an idea, a conception of herself as a perfect society, meaning that you can find everything that you need within the Catholic faith to come to holiness. It's kind of like walking into the perfect brunch buffet, and there is everything possible you could want there to satisfy your hunger. But if you want to pay your $8 at the door these days, it's probably more like $27.50 at the door, and then just walk out. I can't stop you. And it's kind of an analogy in the Catholic faith that Christ gave us the deposit of faith and the sacraments and the wisdom of the tradition and the example of the saints. And we have to cooperate with those graces that have been offered to us, lay hold of them, make them our own. And it's possible to step into the Catholic Church and say, man, this is a great place to find people to exploit.
Yeah.
Maybe I can turn a buck by, writing a new book in Catholic publishing and, try and make some money out of this. Or maybe I can be a great teacher and rise to fame and prominence in the Catholic Church. Or, maybe I'll be the world's greatest organist and they'll hire me to play at the Basilica in Washington or something. You could go into the Catholic faith with those kind of motives.
Yeah.
Probably better places to make a buck, by the way. But
yeah.
But you see my point.
Yes.
And you'd be misusing the elements that are there for you. And Christ talks about this in his parables. He speaks about the kingdom of God as like four soils. And a farmer goes out and sows seed on the soils and falls on four different kinds of people. And you get four different results, depending on the condition of the disposition of the heart of the one that receives it. But the elements are there of truth and sanctification that can bring us to holiness. And the saints are the proof that it works. If you want evidence that the church is a perfect society, that it has everything internal to its organization, to its constitution, to bring souls to holiness, then you just don't have to look any farther than the saints to see, in fact, that they do come to holiness by laying hold of the elements of the Catholic faith with generosity and sincerity. Now, why do some people not do that? So sin, of course, is kind of a mystery. St. Paul writes in Romans 7 about the condition of the human person, and he says, we have the law of God that instructs us in the way of truth and goodness. We also have the law of the mind. We have the natural law. We have what reason can tell us about living a good, healthy, moral life. But then we have what he calls the law of the members, law of the flesh, and the law of sin and death. And those things are at odds, at war with one another. We're kind of at war with ourselves. And it's not only Catholics that have this experience. If this weren't the case, we wouldn't have the profession of, psychologists and therapists who do turn a buck on this aspect of human experience. And we need grace to get out of that hole, right? We can't just white knuckle it or bootstrap ourselves out of that dilemma. We have to have grace. We have to be reformed, reshaped into the likeness and image of Christ. That process is arduous and difficult, right? Now, I don't want to lay the blame. It's not God's fault, right? But at the same time, the individual who's sort of mired in that muck, to whom a helping hand is not given, is going to have a very hard time getting out of it. So it's both a work of grace, but it's also a work of our own personal cooperation. God can offer the grace. We've got to reach out and grab it. But we have to have grace to reach out to. We can't just bootstrap ourselves out of our moral dilemma. And so some souls are in darkness because they haven't been offered a helping hand. Maybe someone hasn't reached out to them in kindness and love and shown them the face of Christ, and offered some way for them to reconceive of their circumstances and come to live a new and better life.
All right, and Gerard, thank you so much for your email. A quick one here from Randy as we're going to break. Why does the profession of faith begin with the words, I believe in God? And why does one profess a belief that there is only one God?
Oh, thanks. I really appreciate the question, because from the Catholic point of view, belief in God or the existence of God is the fundamental truth towards which everything else in the religion, everything else in our life tends. And the reason we hold the belief in one God is because the contrary hypothesis, maybe that there are many gods. Well, if there are many gods, then all of those gods have to share divinity in common, right? And they themselves are dependent on some higher principle. And as the pagan gods were, of course, they weren't omnipotent or almighty or the creation of or the source of everything. As Catholics, we're trying to aim at the highest good.
There you go. Appreciate that. Thanks so much for your email. In a moment, we're going to go to Rollo in San Antonio and possibly Angelina in South Jersey. A couple lines available for you right now at 833-288-EWTN, 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion. It's Call to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. We're going to begin today with Rollo in San Antonio, listening on the great Guadalupe Radio. Rollo, what's on your mind today?
Yes, my question is for the interview. You're Don Martin. I want to know if you can, I'm driving, but I want to know if you can tell the listeners about the mortal sin of joining Freemasonry society, that you will be excommunicated, that you can never join the church again, and also about abortion, you will be excommunicated.
Yeah, thanks, Rollo. I appreciate the question. So if I understood correctly, you would like to mention, you'd like me to mention that the canon law says that Catholics cannot join the Masonic Lodge, and that's true. Now, I'm hesitant. I think you wanted me to make a claim about mortal sin in this case, and I'm very hesitant to ever state that another soul, that I can say with certainty that some other soul is in the state of mortal sin. That's really not given to me to know. What I can know, what the Lord reveals to us, is that some actions are objectively grave. They're gravely wrong, and we should not perform them. The contents of the Ten Commandments being case in point. You can't murder, you can't steal, you can't commit adultery or bear false witness. Those things are gravely wrong. But at the same time, it's possible for a soul to commit a fault like that, but not to do so with impunity. They can act in ignorance. Maybe they can act under compulsion, in which case their action, though gravely wrong, may not be imputable to them as gravely wrong, and so it would not be a mortal sin in their case. And I would say that the situation with Freemasonry is very similar, that while the Church says one should not join the Masonic Lodge, because historically Masonry has positioned itself against the Catholic faith. It's been in opposition to the Catholic faith and worked to reduce Catholic influence in society. And the Masonic Lodge propounds doctrines that run flat contrary to the teaching of the Catholic Church, in particular the doctrine of indifferentism. For these reasons, a Catholic should not join the Masonic Lodge. That being said, there are Catholics who unknowingly are members of the Masonic Lodge, and they are not aware that canon law does not permit this. And so they act in ignorance, and they act not with bad faith, but in good faith, in sincerity. Now, at such time as they become aware of their obligation, then the question of imputability arises. But if they act in ignorance, I would certainly not want to suggest that those souls are in the state of mortal sin because of acting in ignorance. And I think most people in a lot of these men's fraternal organizations, that they go in thinking, well, this is just a nice little club, and I'm going to make some friends, and maybe we'll raise some money for children or some good cause like that. And they don't have ill will, and so I wouldn't want to impute mortal sin to a soul like that.
Very good. Rollo, thank you so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. Looks like one line available right now, 833-288-3986. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Going now to Shane in Fort Wayne. I like that. Listening on Redeemer Radio today. Shane, what's on your mind?
Yeah, my question is for Dr. Anders. I've listened to your show for quite some time now, and I'm a Protestant. I mean, I'm not saying that in a proud way, but I feel like St. Paul, when he's talking to King Agrippa, and King Agrippa says, "Thou almost persuadest me to become a Catholic." So I was wondering what necessarily might be the process. Yeah,
thank you. What a delightful call. That's the kind we like to get. Thank you so much. So, and I love the comparison with King Agrippa. That's I'm going to remember that one today. So the easiest thing to do is just reach out to your local Catholic parish. You can call the office and tell them that almost you are persuaded to become a Catholic. Now, what they'll probably do is put you into a class for inquirers, for people like yourself, called the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults, RCIA. And that is simply, most parishes have a class that runs from fall to spring, and it concludes before Easter. And people who are interested in becoming Catholic, after they're instructed in the faith, will make a profession of faith and be received formally into church around the time of Easter. So you could reach out and ask about RCIA or the process for becoming a Catholic or what that parish has available, and they'll hook you up. They'll help you out.
Yeah, very good deal. All right, Shane, thank you so much for your call. Glad that you're listening to us on Redeemer Radio. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Before we go to our next call, David, the analogy that you led off the program with about the buffet, I thought that was a winner. That was really, really good.
Well, thanks, Tom.
You got to remember that.
I'm just thinking about food all the time. That's my problem.
That must be it. All right. Let's go to John in Columbus, Ohio right now, listening on the great St. Gabriel Radio. John, what's on your mind today?
Well, hi, guys. I'm a cradle Catholic. I was born, my mother was very spiritual and prayed for me all the time because for about 50 years I didn't go to church, and I was basically agnostic for the most part. I lived all over the country, and one of the places I lived was down south, below the Mason-Dixon line, and many of the people down there, as you probably know, are non-Catholic, and I was the odd one out, and many of my friends down there who were good people, Protestants, they were Baptists, Presbyterians, et cetera. When they died, they were, as I say, good people as far as I could tell. When they died, did they go to purgatory as do Catholics when they die?
Yeah, thanks.
And when I pray for them, is it okay to pray for them in purgatory?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the question. So purgatory is not only for Catholics. Purgatory is for any soul that dies in the state of grace, but is not yet purified of attachment to sin enough to enter the beatific vision. And so, there's no telling who we might meet in purgatory.
Yeah.
There's no telling. Can you pray for souls in purgatory that are not Catholic? Of course you can. And that would be a very pious thing to do, and that would be a noble thing to do, and a meritorious thing to do. How to go about doing it? Well, praying for the souls in purgatory is simply asking God to have mercy on the souls in purgatory, and that your merits and prayers, or the merits of prayers of the church and of the saints, be applied in their case for their purification from sin and their exiting purgatory sooner.
Yeah.
Now, the most efficacious prayer for the souls in purgatory is the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And so you can always request that Masses be said for the deceased souls. And look, you don't have to be Catholic to ask a priest to say a Mass for your intention. You don't have to be, right? And you could go ask him to please say a Mass for your loved one. Or you could become Catholic, and you could have a Mass said for your loved one. There are prayers for the dead that are part of the Catholic patrimony, and you could look some of those up and learn them and pray them. You don't have to do this. I like to visit the cemetery because it's convenient to me to do it. It's not too onerous to get to the cemetery where some of my loved ones are buried, and I go visit their graves, and I'll offer prayers for the repose of their soul. And I find that comforting to myself personally because it enhances my sense of connectedness to people that I love that I've lost. And the Catholic faith tells me that I'm not totally lost to them, that we're just, they're taking a trip.
Yeah.
And we'll meet up again.
Beautiful thing. John, thank you so much for your call. Call to Communion here on EWTN. If you're just joining us, we're taking your calls at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're watching us on TV, you might consider an email. ctc@ewtn.com is the address. ctc@ewtn.com. All right, let's go to Miguel right now in El Centro, California, listening on YouTube. Miguel, what's on your mind today?
Good morning, guys. Question: is it a mortal sin to take have the Holy Eucharist and when the priest offers it in your hand or the palm of your hand, or it has to be in the mouth?
Thank you.
Because I guess I have friends of mine that think
Sure.
want to know exactly.
I understand the question.
Thank you very much.
Let me ask you something, Miguel. Do you think the church, in its law, would permit the faithful, would encourage the faithful, would facilitate the faithful in engaging in an action that was mortally sinful in the very heart of their Eucharistic liturgy? Do you think the church, in her discernment and wisdom, would permit the faithful to do that?
Absolutely not.
Yeah, I agree with you.
No.
I agree with you. I mean, Christ entrusted the transmission of the faith, the deposit of faith, to the church with the promise that the gates of hell would not prevail against it. And it's an unthinkable proposition that our mother, the church, would deceive us about the proper way to worship God and lead us into mortal sin in our most vulnerable moments of intimacy with Jesus. That's unthinkable. And the church permits communion in the hand as an allowable option. And, we can have debates and arguments among liturgists about, this or that form is more or less edifying or more or less reverent. And those have a place in the life of the church. But what it boils down to is the church in her wisdom permits this practice. And the church is our mother, and she would not deceive us about a matter of such importance.
Miguel, thank you so much for your call. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. We're going now to Nick in Cummings, Georgia, listening on our great affiliate there, The Quest, in the Atlanta area. Hey there, Nick. What's on your mind today?
Hi, Dr. Anders. It's an honor. Thank you. I have a Greek Orthodox friend here locally, and I'm a cradle Catholic. He brought about the idea of the essence/energy distinction, and somehow it's tied into the filioque. And I'm having a hard time understanding what its implications are, and it seems like we're speaking the same language, and I'm trying to see where we're divided.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the question. So there are Eastern theologians who like to make a big deal of the essence and energies distinction, and there are Latin theologians who like to make a big deal of the distinction and assert that this is some sort of profound difference between the Latin West and the Greek East. And terminologically, it may be. I myself have a hard time getting very worked up about it for this reason, because I think in both the Latin and the Greek tradition, you have agreement that God's essence is unknowable. No one has seen God, the gospel says, but the Son of God has made him known. We don't know God in his essence. The spiritual interpretation, the typological interpretation of Moses' ascent to Mount Sinai, Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Moses indicates this. Moses goes up in the mountain and says, let me see your face. God says, you're not going to see my face. You're not going to see my face, right? We don't see the face of God. And in the Latin tradition, we're so serious about the hiddenness of God's essence that in Thomistic theology, and most of your Greek folks that are very into energies and essences, they kind of bristle at the name of Thomas. They shouldn't, but they do. St. Thomas himself says, we can't even speak about divine essence in a univocal manner. And he gets this, of course, from Dionysius the Areopagite, who is the Greekiest Greek guy, Syriac actually, but same thing, same tradition. And he says, we can't even speak univocally about the essence of God. Anything we say about God, the best we can do is to speak by analogy. God is like this. God is like that. He seems like this. He's a bit like that. But the Fourth Lateran Council says, but whenever we predicate analogously of God, the disanalogy, the way that God is unlike our predications, is infinitely greater. So you take any predicate you want to apply to God. Let's say intelligent. I have some idea what intelligence means. Is God intelligent? Well, in a manner of speaking. But absolutely nothing like human intelligence. What intelligence is in God is so vastly different that I'm just babbling when I say that God is intelligent. Or that God is beautiful, or that God is anything, right? And so I know God through his effects. I know God through his effects. I know him through the act of creation. I know him through the incarnation. I know him through the person, through the sacred humanity of Jesus. I know him through the events of salvation history. I know him through acts of divine providence. I know him by acts of faith. I know him through his effects. I don't know him in his essence. Now, the promise of the beatific vision, 1 Corinthians 13, is that now we see as through a glass darkly. Then we will see face to face. Now, some of our Eastern brothers and sisters get a little funny about the Catholic language of beatific vision. And they don't really like that language. And they don't want to acknowledge that we do, in fact, see God in his essence in the blessed life. So that is a point of difference. The way they conceive of everlasting life in the Godhead is a little bit different from the Latin tradition. But I find this essence and energy business to be helpfully analogous to the Thomistic distinction between what we can know about God and himself and what we can know only by analogous predication.
Nick, thank you so much for your call. Quick question here from Joseph on YouTube. What is the major reason that the Oriental Orthodox do not accept the papacy?
Okay. The major reason they don't accept the papacy. So the Oriental Orthodox, first of all, reject the Council of Chalcedon. Council of Chalcedon is heavily associated with Pope Leo. The Council of Chalcedon is famous for having affirmed Leo's tome. Leo's tome was a statement of papal Christology about the two natures of Jesus. Now, since the Oriental Orthodox reject the doctrine of Chalcedon, which is associated in particular with the Pope, they're going to associate the papacy historically with what they regard as a heretical error about Christology.
So that would be a non-starter for them.
That's kind of a non-starter.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you go. And Joseph, thank you so much for your question via YouTube. We do appreciate hearing from you. It is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. If you'd like to get in, now is a great time to call. In fact, if you call right now, we can probably get you on today's show, and then you won't have to wait around. So here's the phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Those of you watching on TV today, you can shoot us an email, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com, or you can text the letters EWTN to 55000. Back in a flash with lots more. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Do stay with us. What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about it here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. All right, let us go to Benjamin in Canton, Georgia, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Hey there, Benjamin. What's on your mind today?
Hey, guys. Thanks for taking my call. I just found out about this program a few weeks ago, and I'm just amazed at Dr. Anders' ability to be able to answer all these questions on the spot. It is just really refreshing. And so thank you for being on the show. And my question is in regards to John 6:51, where it talks about unless you eat the Son of Flesh of man, you will not have eternal life.
Mm-hmm.
How does that relate to those of other faiths, of Protestant brothers and sisters? I mean, there's a lot of people who are holy who aren't Catholic. What does this verse mean to them and their salvation?
Okay, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So let me back up a little bit and talk about the purpose of receiving Christ in the Eucharist. And it can't simply be that I am holding the body and blood of Christ in my hands. That can't be the totality of the meaning of the reception of Holy Communion, because it's possible to hold the body and blood of Christ in your hands and yet not be united to him in charity. After all, the Roman soldiers who nailed him to the cross held his body and blood in their hands.
Yeah.
But they were not united to him in charity.
No.
And Pope Benedict has said in his encyclical on the love of God that our reception of Holy Communion is not reducible to, and this is his phraseology, a static reception of the incarnate Logos. It's not just statically receiving the incarnate Lord, but it has to be a participation in his self-offering, in his self-oblation, in his self-sacrifice. So St. Paul, when Paul talks about that worship in spirit and in truth that unites us to God, or what he calls the rational act of worship, he says this is the offering of your bodies in sacrifice. This is your rational worship. This is your act of worship. And so our participation in the Eucharist is ordered to the conformity of our whole life to Jesus, which is especially manifest in the life of charity, as we find in 1 Corinthians 13, love being patient and kind and long-suffering and not keeping account of wrongs and hoping all things and suffering all things, bearing all things and giving all things. That's the ultimate meaning and purpose of the Eucharist. Now, the liturgical and sacramental expression of that we have is the heart and soul and the fulfillment, the culmination, the source and summit of the Catholic faith. But it can't be abstracted from the spiritual life or the interior life or the life of charity. All that is to say that the grace of God is present for us most manifestly, most fully, most completely in the liturgical life of the Catholic faithful. And that's the source and summit of our Christian life. It's most manifest there in the liturgical life of the Catholic faithful. But the Church tells us that there are elements of truth and sanctification outside that liturgical community. So take, for example, my Protestant family that raised me. Well, they gave me the Bible. They had me baptized. You know, my parents had the sacrament of matrimony. And my parents, my grandparents were holy, pious, and virtuous people, some of them quite venerable. And though they lacked the fullness of the Catholic faith, they had elements of truth and sanctification that the Church says can be for them a means of salvation, a means of holiness. And so we look at our separated brethren, and that's exactly how we see them. We see them as separated brethren, people who have elements of truth and sanctification that we can celebrate, elements that could be for them a means of redemption and salvation. But they lack the fullness, and they lack the full corporate unity of the people of God in that central act of worship, which is the Holy Eucharist. Now, is that a deficit in their life? Would they be better served if they had the whole thing? Yes, of course they would. And, I know in my own family life, my own growing up, and particularly my Christian school where I was raised, I lacked the benefit of the Catholic intellectual tradition. This a lack that I feel very deeply. And while I had the Scriptures, I did not know how to read them. I was taught to read the Bible as a fundamentalist, which meant that, like I was thinking about this yesterday, actually. Genesis chapter 6, the story of Noah. The text tells us that God sent the flood because of the evil in men's hearts, because of what men were thinking. Now, when St. Peter in the New Testament looks at that story, he says, the washing away of the wicked in Genesis 6 is a symbol for the washing away of our sins in baptism. The ark is a typology of baptism and the pledge of a right conscience before God. That's the significance of the text. And so when I read it as a Catholic now, I can look back at Genesis 6 and I can say, well, this is a story about the purification of my interior life, that I not be like those whom God condemned for the wickedness of their thoughts. Then I seek to make the pledge of a good conscience before God. That's the right way to read Genesis 6. You know how we read it? We sent exploratory trips to Mount Ararat to look for an ark.
Really?
I'm not kidding. I remember growing up as a child and learning about archaeological expeditions off to Turkey to try to find the remnants, of a wooden boat on top of a mountain. And I'm thinking, as a Catholic, it just ain't about that.
No.
So I had the Bible, but I didn't have the benefit of the Catholic interpretive tradition to know what to do with it. So did I have elements of truth and sanctification present to me? Yes. But I would have been in better shape if I had had the fullness of Catholic tradition to inform that participation so that I could have the mind of Christ, that I could engage in what St. Paul calls a rational act of worship.
Hope that's helpful for you, Benjamin. Thanks so much for your call. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Going now to St. Clair Shores, Michigan, and Ralph listening on YouTube today. Ralph, what's on your mind?
I have a question about Holy Mary and how to explain that she is without sin. I know it says the Immaculate Conception, and St. Gabriel appeared to her and said, "Hail Mary, full of grace." Other than that, I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah, sure, thanks. I appreciate the question.
Explaining it to a non-Catholic.
Sure.
Yeah.
So if you are engaged in dialogue with someone whose basic operating principle is, I will only believe those doctrines that are expressly stated in the Bible. If that's their beginning point, okay, then you're going to have a hard time persuading them of the dogma of Mary's Immaculate Conception or perpetual sinlessness just based on the literal words of Scripture alone. I mean, you can make some arguments for it, but they're not going to be conclusive arguments. They're just going to be suggestive arguments. So the first thing that I want to do whenever I'm in dialogue with a non-Catholic about any Catholic doctrine, whether it's Mariology or some other doctrine, is I don't want to concede the terms of the debate to their principles. I don't want to start the discussion assuming what Protestants call sola scriptura, assuming that the Bible is our only data set on divine revelation. I want to push back on that. Before I get into Mary, I want to push back and say, how do we know what Christian doctrine is? That's the first question. So rather than just pointing to this or that verse, how do I know what Christian doctrine is? And the answer to that question is, what did Jesus provide? What did Jesus tell us about discerning the content of the faith? And one thing you'll learn is that Jesus never, ever says the content of the faith is simply reducible to whatever can be found literally stated in the Bible. Jesus never gives us that principle. On the contrary, Christ gives us oral tradition. Go into all nations, teach everything I have commanded you, all of which was oral, and I'll be with you to the end of the age. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. It's the teaching church and the oral tradition of the Catholic faith that is the basis of the church's proclamation given to us by Jesus. So it's important to press on that and say the principal way we have our doctrines of Mariology intact is because this is what has always been believed by the Catholic faith from day one. Now, Protestant thinkers who are like straight shooters and people of good faith and goodwill who have some respect for Christian antiquity have recognized this. So I'm going to name a name. You probably hadn't heard of him, but a guy named Francis Turretin. I mentioned Turretin because among Protestants who are in the know, who know something about Protestant history, Turretin's about as anti-Catholic a fellow as you could imagine. He was John Calvin's successor in Geneva in the 17th century. And, no friend of Catholic doctrine. But Turretin said about Mary's, I think it's her sinlessness and her perpetual virginity, that he could not bring himself to deny this, in spite of the obscurity of the Bible on this matter, because of the consistent, ubiquitous witness of Christian history on this doctrine. And he could not bring himself to deny something that every Christian in antiquity believed and affirmed. The witness of the ancient church was just too strong on this. That's Francis Turretin, the anti-Catholic 17th century Protestant. Now, why did the fathers hold this? Why did they believe in Mary's sinlessness? Why did they believe in her perpetual virginity? Why did they believe in her immaculate conception? Well, because of the manifestly biblical doctrine that Mary is the mother of God and that Mary is the second Eve. So every other Mariological doctrine flows from those two core conceptions. Number one, that Mary is the mother of God, and that Mary is the second Eve. So what do we know about the first Eve? Well, she said no to God, and we all got sunk. We all suffered through the disobedience of the first man and the first woman.
Mm-hmm.
Well, is there a second Adam? Well, yeah, 1 Corinthians says the second Adam is Jesus. Is there a second Eve? Is there a second Eve? Sacred tradition says unambiguously that woman is Mary. Now, the parallelism is stated for us in the Bible itself. So Eve says no to God, Mary says yes. At the Annunciation, be it done to me according to thy word. If you do that, you're perfect. I mean, if that's your disposition, be it done to me according to thy word, you got the rest of the Christian life licked. It's no problem. That's it. That's the whole show right there. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's the whole show. That's her life. Be it done to me according to thy word. All right. In John chapter 2, I mean, if you couldn't be more plain, what's the situation? There's a bunch of stone water jars held with water for the Jewish rites of purification. If that's not a symbol for the old covenant, I don't know what is. Right? And they don't taste very good. They're not appropriate for the wedding feast, which is a symbol in the Bible of Christ's celebration with the church. And Mary turns to Jesus and says, they hadn't got any wine. And he looks at her and says, woman, not mom, but woman, echoing the language of Genesis chapter 3, when God says to the snake that the son of the woman will crush your head.
Mm.
What is that to thee and to me? And then she says to the attendants, do whatever he tells you. And Jesus takes the empty rites of the old covenant and fills them with the living water that if anyone drinks, they will never thirst again, to quote from John chapter 4, two sections later. At the request of the virgin who says, thy will be done. Be it done to me according to thy word, whom he specifically identifies as the woman. The Old Testament, New Testament parallels are profound. If that weren't enough, you turn to Revelation chapter 12, and we find another woman who is specifically identified as the woman who's in conflict with that ancient serpent, the devil. If that doesn't recall Genesis 3, nothing does. And who is she? She is the woman who gives birth to the Christ child, who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. And she's also identified as the mother of all those who believe in Jesus. So Mary is unambiguously the second Eve. All right? She's also the mother of God. And because her parturition of the Son of God and of the church is in the spiritual order, right, to perfection. And it is from her act of obedience and from Christ's obedience that our reformulation as spiritual men and women reborn in Christ takes place. It is fitting that the mother of our Redeemer would, in contrast to the first woman who was a sinner, be preserved from that very sin from which we ourselves will be saved. So these are the kinds of considerations that led the Church Fathers to the elaboration of Mariology.
Great question, Ralph. Thank you so much for it. We appreciate hearing from you today here on EWTN's Call to Communion. I'm Tom Price, reminding you to be sure to join us for a wonderful program on EWTN Radio called Take Two with Jerry and Debbie. This is a great, great Monday through Friday show. We play it for you at noon Eastern. Jerry Usher, of course, been on Catholic radio for many, many years. Debbie Georgiani and their callers take a second look at personal, spiritual, and cultural issues. It's going to be different for you every day, and a lot of fun, too. So do check it out. Take Two with Jerry and Debbie, noon Eastern, Monday through Friday on EWTN Radio. Back to the phones right now for Stephen in St. Louis, listening on the Great Covenant Network. Hello, Stephen. What's on your mind today?
Hello, and thank you. This is a question of a historical nature.
Okay.
A friend of mine recently said that Jesus never existed, that he was just a mythical figure, and we've all heard that before, but what was different about this particular one was the source of the myth. He said it came from Josephus, who was a Israeli rebel leader in the mid-first century.
Absurd.
And he turned coat to the Romans and fed them this pacifistic Messiah that the Jews would accept instead of the military leader that they were all waiting for.
Right.
I'd never heard that before, and
Absurd.
I wonder if you've ever heard it before, and how do you answer
Absurd.
something like that?
Absurd. Totally absurd.
Okay.
Josephus, I think, was about 13 years old when St. Paul penned his first letter to the Thessalonians, regarded by most biblical scholars as the earliest text of the New Testament. Now, Paul has a developed Christology. Paul has a developed doctrine of Jesus, which, by the way, is not pacifistic, but profoundly militaristic. The earliest book in the New Testament has a conquering Jesus who's going to come give what for to those people who don't obey him. Go back and read it. Go read First Thessalonians. So your friend would have us to believe that a 13-year-old Jew invented a complete mythology about a guy who'd only been dead 4 years, right? That he then was able to sell the entire Christian world on in time for Paul to turn around and write the first letter of the New Testament in, quite frankly, a rather militaristic vein. I mean, the whole hypothesis is just patently absurd. Now, when Paul writes 1 Thessalonians, Paul did not know Jesus according to the flesh. That's what he tells us himself. Paul received the faith, the oral tradition of the faith, from those who were better instructed. Now, he had direct revelation from Jesus on the road to Damascus, but then he goes up and he spends time with the apostles in Jerusalem, with Peter, James, and John.
Mm-hmm.
He spends a couple years in solitude praying and studying the scriptures and consulting with the church there. So Paul was engaged in a living Christian community with liturgical practice and traditions and sayings of Jesus that had been passed down for, a good decade or so before he begins his own public ministry. And all of this is taking place when Josephus is in diapers.
Yeah. A little good ammunition for you there when you're talking to folks like this. Stephen, thank you so much for your call. Let's go now to Priscilla in Albuquerque, listening on EWTN television today. Priscilla, what's on your mind?
Well, I would like to know, I saw it on EWTN about this woman that claimed that about 1,000 communists entered the Catholic Church to become priests. And I would like to know if any of them ever converted.
Yes, they sure did. They absolutely did. Now, I'm going to tell you a story. It's an anecdote. I have it from a now deceased and very elderly Dominican priest. All right, you know that when someone goes to confession to a priest, that priest is never allowed to reveal what he learns in the confessional.
Ever.
Okay, ever. However, there's no such prohibition on the penitent revealing what he told the priest.
Okay.
So we have this information not from the priest to whom the confession was made, but ultimately from the penitent who revealed this story to other people. So my friend was a Dominican priest from Ireland who died at the age of 101, okay? And he had the opportunity to live and study with a number of Spanish Dominicans when the church was under a great deal of persecution in Spain. So he had firsthand knowledge of this from Dominican converts of his. Now, here's the story. So there was a Dominican priory in Spain, and there was a communist fellow who entered the Dominican order under false pretenses, with the goal of becoming ordained as a Catholic priest in order to lead people out of the Catholic Church. He was going to try to infiltrate the church and undermine it from within. So he goes in, and he's, by all intents, kind of a perfect religious. He's obedient to his superiors. He does what he's told. He does his studies. But all of it is insincere on his part. And before he takes his vows, he has to go to his spiritual director, his confessor, and he has to make a confession. And so he goes to the confessor, and he says, I just want you to know, now we're under the seal of the confessional, so you can't reveal this to anybody, that I don't believe, and I'm a communist, and I'm here because I want to undermine the church. And the confessor says, well, all right then, and he leaves. And the next day they have their chapter meeting, and the fathers say, well, does anybody know any reason why we shouldn't let brother so-and-so into the order? And of course, the confessor keeps his mouth shut. Says, no, he's obedient, does what he's told, great guy.
Wow.
Doesn't say a word against him. So he makes his first vows. And here come the second vows, a few years later. The next stage of the process, basically.
Right.
Same thing happens. I just want you to know I'm here to undermine the church, and I don't really believe, and I'm a communist, blah, blah, blah. All right, off you go. Anybody know any reason? Don't know any reason. Brother so-and-so is just fine. Let him in. And this process continues up to the moment of the guy's conversion, up to the moment of his ordination. So he goes in one more time to the confessor and says, those last 2 or 3 times I was in here telling you I didn't believe a lick of this stuff, I was testing you. He says, of course I know that. I wanted to see if you were going to keep the seal of confessional. Yeah, well, I did. He says, I know that. I'm persuaded by your example. I have renounced my communism.
Wow.
I am now a sincere Catholic, and this time I genuinely wish to be ordained so I can serve the church. And so that man who entered the church to undermine it became a pious Dominican priest.
Well,
won over by the example of his confreres.
We hope there's plenty of folks like that.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, there you go. Priscilla, thank you so much for your call. That was a great call. Let's go to Ed right here in Birmingham, Alabama, listening on Guadalupe Radio. Ed, what's on your mind today?
Well, I've got a comment first on energies in essence as a Byzantine Catholic. I don't think Christ in the Incarnation is going to reveal anything false about the essence of God in an expression of the energies of God in the Incarnation. But my question is concerning what does Calvin mean by unconditional election, and what's our Catholic response? And also, what does the Catholic Church mean about the treasury of marriage? Because I've heard Protestants criticizing that point of Catholic theology, and I'm not fully understand it myself. Could you explain what the treasury
means? Yeah, absolutely. So Calvin's doctrine of unconditional election is that God elects some people from the foundation of the world for eternal salvation, not because of anything in them, but for some inscrutable reason of his own purposes, and that he reprobates, specifically by positive decree, the rest of the humanity to damnation for similarly inscrutable purposes. Now, the Catholic's position is in some places subtly different and in some places very different. The Catholic Church agrees with the doctrine of unconditional election. God does not elect people for salvation because of anything in them. God didn't pick Abraham, for example, to be the father of the Hebrew people and ultimately the progenitor of the Messiah, because of anything inherent in Abraham, but for God's own inscrutable purposes and out of his mercy. So in that sense, we would agree with Calvin's position. This is how we would disagree with the positive decree of election. For Calvin, the decree of election is followed by the decree to impute Christ's righteousness to the elect, right, without their moral cooperation, without their free will, so that they are saved by faith alone, justified by faith alone, saved by faith alone. The Catholic position is that when God elects a person, when God predestines a person and offers them the gift of grace, it presupposes their free cooperation and the infusion of Christ's righteousness such that they are actually morally transformed and can thereby merit salvation. So it's election, but it's election to a grace that transforms us and enables us to merit salvation. So that's a difference in the way we think of the whole Ordo Salutis, or order of salvation. Catholics also repudiate the Calvinist doctrine of a specific decree of reprobation. We don't think that that's the way. God does not specifically predestine anybody to hell. Now, when it comes to the doctrine of the treasury of merits, it's simply this, that it is a very, very biblical doctrine. Find it in Genesis chapter 18, when Abraham challenges God and says, "Will you punish the righteous along with the wicked?" And God's response is, "No, but for the sake of the righteous, I will spare the wicked." It's simply that the merits of one person can avail to win God's grace or mercies or favor on behalf of the less righteous. That's the idea. St. Paul says this in Colossians chapter 1 when he says, "I fill up in my own flesh what's lacking in the sufferings of Christ for the sake of his body, the church." That we can be participants in the distribution of God's grace and mercy by our own holiness of life, and that the prayer of a righteous man can avail much on behalf of a less righteous person, and that divine economy, if you will, can continue even after death, such that the merits and prayers of the saints in heaven can be applied, can avail much for souls on earth. So I can be helped by the merits and prayers of St. Augustine, for example, or the merits and prayers of the Blessed Virgin, or the merits of prayers of Francis of Assisi. These merits and prayers can come to my aid. I can seek them, I can ask for them, and most efficaciously by seeking to imitate the lives of holiness of the saints, but also by their direct intercession.
Ed, thanks so much for your call. Could not get to Suzanne in Morgantown, West Virginia, Joseph in Tampa, Jason in Portland, Oregon. Folks, please call us back on a future show. We'll put you at the head of the line. Hey, Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
Don't forget, we do this program on EWTN Radio Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. See you next time here on EWTN's Call to Communion. God bless.